On the morning of December 7th, 1941, at precisely 6:45, Ensign William Tanner stood on the bridge of USS Ward, his fingers wrapped around a cold mug of coffee that had long since lost its warmth. The destroyer patrol vessel cut through the dark waters just outside Pearl Harbor's entrance, her crew exhausted from another monotonous night of anti-submarine patrol. No one aboard could have imagined that within minutes they would fire the first American shots of World War II, or that 3 years later, this same ship would meet her end in the very war she helped begin. The Ward was no stranger to transformation. Originally designated as Destroyer Number 139, she had been commissioned in 1918. Too late to see action in the First World War, for 2 decades she languished in reserve, a forgotten relic of another era. But as tensions mounted across the Pacific, the United States Navy desperately needed every available vessel. The Ward was recommissioned in January 1941 and assigned to the inshore patrol, tasked with protecting the approaches to America's most important Pacific naval base. Her crew consisted largely of reservists from St. Paul, Minnesota, men who had never seen combat and barely knew the difference between port and starboard when they first arrived. Lieutenant William Outerbridge, her commanding officer, had assumed command only 2 days earlier. He was still learning the names of his officers when the morning watch spotted something unusual in the restricted waters near the harbor entrance. "Captain to the bridge!" The call shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Outerbridge arrived within seconds, his uniform hastily buttoned. "Quartermaster." H.E. Renbig pointed toward a dark object breaking the surface approximately 1,500 yards distant. The USS Condor, a minesweeper on patrol, had reported a periscope sighting minutes earlier. Now, through the growing light, the Ward's crew could see it clearly, a small submarine, its conning tower barely visible above the waterline, trailing behind the supply ship Antares as she prepared to enter Pearl Harbor. According to records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, this was one of 5 Japanese Miite submarines deployed to penetrate Pearl Harbor's defenses during the attack. Each carried a 2-man crew and 2 torpedoes launched from larger submarines offshore. The submarine shadowing the Antares had likely been trying to slip through the harbor's anti-submarine nets when the gate opened to admit the supply vessel. Outerbridge made his decision in seconds. This was a restricted area. No American submarines were scheduled to operate here. Whatever vessel lurked in those waters was unauthorized and hostile. General quarters, all hands to battle stations. The alarm shrieked through the Ward's compartments. Men tumbled from their bunks, pulling on shoes and life jackets as they ran. Gun crews scrambled to their positions. In the engine room, men threw switches and opened valves, coaxing every available knot of speed from the aging destroyer's machinery. Within 4 minutes, the Ward was ready for combat. Her bow knives through the waves as she charged toward the intruding submarine at maximum speed, her guns trained and ready to fire the opening salvo of America's entry into the Second World War. At 6:48 on that Sunday morning, the Ward closed to within 50 yards of the mysterious submarine. The intruder sat low in the water, moving slowly, seemingly unaware that it had been detected. Its conning tower rose barely 4 feet above the surface, painted dark gray or black, with what appeared to be a small platform structure. Several crew members later reported seeing a figure in the conning tower, though in the confusion and excitement of the moment, observations varied wildly. Outerbridge positioned his ship for a perfect firing solution. The Ward's number 1 gun, a 4-inch 50 caliber weapon mounted forward, had a clear shot. "Commence firing!" The order crackled through the speaking tubes. The first shell screamed over the submarine, missing high. Gun Captain Russell Knapp and his crew on the number 3 gun, mounted aft, had a better angle. The second shot struck true, hitting the submarine at the waterline where the conning tower met the hull. The shell punched through the thin metal and exploded inside, creating a gaping wound that immediately began flooding the pressure hull. The submarine lurched, listing heavily to starboard. Black smoke billowed from the damaged conning tower. The Ward surged past her stricken target, and as she did, Chief Torpedoman's mate William Mascowick released a pattern of depth charges set for shallow detonation. 4 thunderous explosions erupted in the destroyer's wake, each sending massive columns of white water skyward. The concussive force of the underwater blasts finished what the gun had started. When the water settled, the submarine had vanished. Oil bubbled to the surface, spreading in an iridescent slick that marked the grave of the Meade submarine and her 2-man crew. The ward circled the area, searching for survivors or additional contacts. There were none. The entire engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes. Outerbridge immediately drafted a message to 14th Naval District Headquarters. "We have dropped depth charges upon sub-operating in defensive sea area." He recognized the significance of what had just occurred, but chose his words carefully, knowing that a false alarm could trigger unnecessary panic. Minutes later, after confirming the attack with his officers, he sent a second, more definitive message. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area." The message reached shore at 7:12. Naval officers debated its significance. Submarine contacts were not uncommon. Most proved to be whales, schools of fish, or instrumental errors. Should they wake Admiral Husband Kamal, commander of the Pacific Fleet, on a Sunday morning for what might be a false alarm? The discussion continued as precious minutes ticked away. Meanwhile, the ward resumed her patrol, her crew electric with excitement and nervous energy. They had engaged an enemy submarine in American waters. Surely this meant something significant was about to happen. Some men wrote quick letters home, wanting to document their participation in what they sensed was a historic moment. Others cleaned and reloaded their weapons, anticipating further action. At 7:55, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu. The ward's crew watched in horror as bombs began falling on battleship. Ro, the submarine they had sunk, had been the vanguard of a massive attack. Their early warning, delivered over an hour before the air raid began, had been lost in bureaucratic uncertainty and peacetime complacency. The ward had fired the first shots of America's war, but no one had been listening. In the chaotic aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, the ward's contribution was initially overlooked amid the catastrophic losses suffered. By the Pacific Fleet, 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, over 2,000 American servicemen killed, and the Naval Air Station decimated. Yet, as the Navy pieced together the timeline of December 7th, the significance of the ward's action became clear. The destroyer had detected and destroyed an enemy combatant more than an hour before the air raid commenced, providing warning that might have saved lives had it been properly heeded. The inquiry into the Pearl Harbor disaster examined every decision made that morning. The ward's messages came under particular scrutiny. Why had the warning not been taken seriously? Multiple officers testified about the prevalence of false submarine contacts and the desire to avoid crying wolf. The explanation satisfied no one, but the finger-pointing changed nothing. America was at war, and the ward was needed. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the destroyer continued patrol duties around the Hawaiian Islands. Her crew, once green reservists from Minnesota, transformed into seasoned veterans. They hunted submarines in waters that now swarmed with American vessels, escorted convoys to Midway and beyond, and trained newer crews in anti-submarine warfare techniques. The ward became something of a legend, the ship that fired first, though her celebrity status did little to improve her material condition. By early 1944, the ward was showing her age. Nearly 3 decades old, she had been built using technologies that now seemed ancient. Her machinery required constant maintenance. Her hull plates, thin to begin with, had corroded from years in salt water. Her weapon systems, once cutting-edge, were obsolete compared to newer destroyers rolling off American production lines. The Navy faced a decision: scrap the aging vessel or find a new role for her. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. As American forces pushed westward across the Pacific, they needed close air support for amphibious landings. Aircraft carriers provided some capability, but their planes had to travel significant distances and could not loiter over beachheads for extended periods. The Navy experimented with converting older destroyers into high-speed transports, designated a PD, carrying small numbers of troops but arriving quickly and providing fire support during landings. In July 1944, USS Ward entered Maury Island Naval Shipyard in California for conversion. Workers stripped away much of her original armament, removing torpedo tubes and several gun mounts to reduce topside weight. They constructed accommodations for approximately 150 troops and added equipment for landing operations. The destroyer's sleek lines disappeared under additional structures, but she gained a new purpose. After a month of intensive work, Ward emerged as APD-16, ready for the dangerous work of landing troops on hostile shores. Her new assignment took her to the Philippine Islands, where General Douglas MacArthur's forces prepared to fulfill his famous promise. "I shall return." The Ward joined a massive fleet gathering for the invasion of Leyte, a crucial operation that would cut Japanese supply lines and provide a base for the final assault on Japan itself. The men who had hunted submarines in the waters off Pearl Harbor would now face an even more terrifying threat: the kamikaze, Japanese pilots who turned their aircraft into manned missiles. The invasion of Leyte began on October 20, 1944. With the largest naval force yet assembled in the Pacific War, USS Ward, now designated a PD-16, formed part of the vast armada approaching the Philippine coast. Her holds carried elements of the 6th Army, soldiers who would establish the initial beachhead at Tacloban. The weather was perfect, the sea calm, and American aircraft controlled the skies overhead. For the first hours of the operation, everything proceeded according to plan. Ward made her approach in the pre-dawn darkness, her crew at battle stations. The troops below decks prepared their equipment, checking weapons and adjusting packs in the cramped troop compartments. Many were veterans of previous landings. Others faced combat for the first time. The naval bombardment had already begun, battleships and cruisers hammering Japanese positions with thousands of rounds of high-explosive shells. The thunder of heavy guns rolled across the water like an approaching storm. At 0700 hours, Ward reached her designated transport area approximately 3,000 yards offshore. Landing craft swung out from their davits, and soldiers clambered down cargo nets into the small boats. The process, practiced countless times in training, proceeded smoothly despite the nervous tension. Within 40 minutes, Ward had launched all her assigned troops and began her secondary mission: fire support for the advancing infantry. For 3 days, the conversion worked perfectly. Ward's remaining guns fired on Japanese positions identified by shore fire control parties. She transported reinforcements and evacuated wounded. Her engineering crews kept the aging machinery running despite the constant demands placed upon it. Her crew began to hope they might survive this operation and many more to come. Then the kamikazes arrived. Japanese commanders, facing certain defeat through conventional means, had authorized the formation of special attack units, Takebutsu Kogeki Tai, known to Americans as kamikaze or divine wind. Pilots, many barely trained and flying obsolete aircraft, volunteered to crash their planes into American ships. They could not match American naval aviation in skill or equipment, but they could transform themselves into guided missiles, each potentially capable of sinking a ship. The first major kamikaze attacks against the Leyte invasion fleet occurred on October 25th. Ward's crew watched in horror as Japanese aircraft, trailing smoke and flames from anti-aircraft fire, pressed home suicide attacks against larger vessels. The cruiser HMAS Australia took a kamikaze hit, suffering heavy casualties but remaining afloat. Other ships were less fortunate. The spectacle was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Men deliberately flying to their deaths, accepting destruction to inflict damage. Ward's anti-aircraft crews blazed away at passing aircraft, their 5-inch guns and smaller automatic weapons joining thousands of others in creating a lethal curtain of steel. The noise was indescribable, a continuous roar punctuated by explosions and the screaming of aircraft engines. Spent shell casings piled up around gun mounts. Men's ears rang from concussion. But they kept firing because stopping meant death. For the next 2 months, Ward operated in Philippine waters, supporting MacArthur's advance. She participated in the Mindoro landings in December, dodging kamikaze attacks that sank or damaged several ships in her task group. Her luck held, though it was a near thing on multiple occasions. Japanese pilots selected larger, more valuable targets when possible, and Ward's relatively small size may have saved her. But everyone knew the luck could not last forever. The kamikazes were becoming more numerous and more desperate. By early December 1944, American forces controlled most of Lady's eastern coast, but Japanese troops held strong positions along the western shore, particularly around Ormoc Bay. Enemy convoys continued landing reinforcements there, prolonging the campaign and inflicting casualties on American forces, pushing across the island's mountainous interior. MacArthur's staff planned an amphibious assault directly into Ormoc Bay, a bold stroke that would cut Japanese supply lines and trap thousands of enemy soldiers. USS Ward received orders to join Task Group 78.3 for the Ormoc operation. The mission was extremely dangerous. The ships would be operating in restricted waters far from major American air bases, vulnerable to land-based aircraft flying from nearby Japanese-controlled airfields. Intelligence reports indicated significant kamikaze forces in the region. Every man aboard Ward understood the risks, but the Navy did not ask for volunteers. Orders were orders. The task group departed Lady Gulf on December 6th, exactly 3 years to the day before the Ward had sunk the Miite submarine at Pearl Harbor. Some of the original crew remained aboard, men who had been present for both the first shot of America's war and now approached what would be its final chapter for their ship. They noted the coincidence but did not dwell on it. Superstition was common among sailors, but professionalism demanded focus on the mission ahead. According to naval records archived by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the task group consisted of destroyers, destroyer escorts, landing ships, and the high-speed transports including Ward. They carried the 77th Infantry Division, approximately 30,000 soldiers who would storm ashore at Ormoc's beaches. Air cover would be minimal and distant. Fighters from Lady's captured airfields operated at the extreme edge of their range. The ships would largely be on their own. The approach to Ormoc Bay on the morning of December 7th was tense but uneventful. Japanese forces ashore seemed surprised by the sudden appearance of American ships. The initial landing waves went ashore with lighter resistance than anticipated. Ward launched her troops successfully and took up a fire support position, her guns hammering enemy positions inland. For several hours, the operation proceeded smoothly. Then, shortly after 1000 hours, the kamikazes struck. They came in groups of 3 and 4, twin-engine bombers and single-engine fighters, some damaged and smoking before they even reached the fleet. American fighter pilots splashed several, but others broke through the combat air patrol. Anti-aircraft fire from the ships created a wall of exploding steel, but the Japanese pilots pressed on with fanatical determination. One after another, aircraft dropped from the sky or slammed into ships, their bombs and fuel transforming into massive fireballs. Ward's gun crews tracked an incoming aircraft, a Nakajima Ki-49 bomber trailing black smoke from its port engine. Multiple ships fired on it. Tracer rounds stitched across its fuselage, and pieces flew off in the slipstream. But the pilot held his course, aiming directly at the destroyer Mayon, positioned near Ward. At the last second, the kamikaze pilot adjusted slightly. Perhaps the control surfaces had been shot away, or maybe the dying pilot made one final correction. The bomber missed Mayon by yards, but slammed directly into USS Ward's port side amidships. The explosion was catastrophic. The Japanese bomber, loaded with fuel and bombs, struck Ward just below the waterline in the engineering spaces. The initial impact tore a massive hole in the destroyer's thin hull plates, but the subsequent explosions from detonating ordnance ripped the ship's midsection apart. Burning aviation fuel sprayed through ruptured compartments, igniting everything it touched. Men in the engineering spaces died instantly, incinerated in the initial blast or crushed by collapsing bulkheads. On deck, the force of the explosion threw men off their feet. The ship lurched violently to port, her list increasing rapidly as seawater poured into the gaping wound. Fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming wooden structures and igniting stored ammunition. Secondary explosions shook the stricken vessel as ready-service ammunition cooked off in the heat. Thick black smoke billowed skyward, marking Ward's agony for miles around. Lieutenant Commander George F. Davis, Ward's captain during her final deployment, immediately assessed the situation. The damage was terminal. Fire mains had been destroyed, leaving no way to fight the spreading flames. The engineering plant was completely destroyed, providing no power or propulsion. The list was increasing rapidly, suggesting catastrophic flooding below. Most critically, fire was spreading toward the forward magazine, which contained tons of explosives. If that magazine detonated, it would completely destroy the ship and kill everyone still aboard. Davis ordered "abandon ship" at approximately 10:07, just minutes after the kamikaze strike. His decision undoubtedly saved lives. The crew executed the order with practiced efficiency despite the chaos. Men grabbed wounded shipmates and carried them to the rails. Life jackets were distributed. Rafts and flotation devices were thrown overboard. Men jumped into the water as flames engulfed more of the ship. Nearby vessels, themselves under attack, maneuvered closer to pick up survivors. The Ward's bow began rising as her stern settled deeper. The list increased past 30 degrees, then 45. Equipment broke loose and slid across decks. Men still aboard scrambled for handholds as their ship transformed into a sinking inferno. The heat became unbearable. Paint blistered and peeled from metal surfaces. More explosions rocked the dying vessel as fire found pockets of ammunition. Within 20 minutes of the kamikaze impact, Ward had taken on a severe list and was clearly sinking. But she was doing so slowly, remaining partially afloat and burning fiercely. This presented a serious problem. The task group could not afford to leave a burning, drifting wreck in Ormuk Bay. The ship might drift ashore and provide cover for Japanese forces. Worse, the fire might spread to the forward magazine, causing a massive explosion that could damage nearby American vessels still engaged in landing operations. Someone would have to sink the Ward deliberately. The destroyer O'Brien received orders to finish off her sister ship. This was not unprecedented. Damaged vessels that could not be saved were routinely scuttled to prevent capture or to eliminate navigation hazards. But what made this situation extraordinary was that O'Brien's captain, Commander William Outerbridge, had commanded the Ward on December 7, 1941, when she fired the first American shots of the war. Now, 3 years later, Outerbridge would fire the last shots at the ship that had made him briefly famous. Records indicate that Outerbridge specifically requested permission to carry out the task. The emotional weight of the moment cannot be overstated. This was the ship on which he had achieved his greatest accomplishment, where his decisive action had provided warning of the Pearl Harbor attack. The men he had commanded 3 years earlier were now in the water, watching their ship die. And Outerbridge would deliver the coup de grace. Commander William Outerbridge stood on O'Brien's bridge, watching USS Ward through binoculars as his former command burned and listed heavily in the waters of Ormuk Bay. The smoke from Ward's funeral pyre rose thousands of feet into the tropical sky, visible for miles. Japanese aircraft still circled overhead, seeking targets. Other American ships continued landing operations or engaged in firefighting and damage control on vessels that had been hit. The battle continued around them, but for this moment, Outerbridge focused entirely on the task he had requested and been granted, sending his old ship to the bottom. It was now early afternoon on December 7, 1944. The bitter symmetry was not lost on anyone. 3 years to the day after Ward had engaged the Miite submarine, she would sink in combat. The ship that opened America's war would not survive to see its conclusion. Some might call it poetic justice or cosmic irony. The sailors who had served aboard her called it tragedy. O'Brien maneuvered into position approximately 2,000 yards from the burning Ward. The destroyer's gun crews trained their weapons on the stricken vessel. The order came down from the bridge: commence firing. The first salvo screamed across the water, shells striking Ward's hull with methodical precision. Outerbridge had made these calculations countless times during the war, determining range, bearing, and target motion. But never before had the target been a ship he loved. The shells punched through Ward's thin plates, opening new wounds in her already battered hull. Each hit accelerated her sinking, water rushing into compartments that had remained intact after the kamikaze strike. The forward section, still relatively undamaged, began settling lower as flooding progressed from stern to bow. O'Brien's gunners were professionals. They did their work efficiently and without wasted ammunition. Several survivors floating in the water near Ward watched the execution. Their emotions were complex and contradictory. Relief that their ordeal was ending mixed with sorrow at witnessing their ship's death. Some men wept openly. Others maintained stoic silence, bearing witness to the end. A few felt anger that any American had to destroy what the Japanese had merely wounded, but all understood the necessity. Ward could not be saved, and she could not be abandoned burning in enemy waters. After approximately 10 salvos, Ward's list became critical. Her port side dipped beneath the surface, and water surged over her deck. The bow rose higher, lifting the forward gun mount clear of the water as if in one final salute. The stars and stripes, miraculously still flying from her mast despite the flames, fluttered in the breeze. Then, with a sudden rush, Ward slipped beneath the waves stern first. The suction pulled debris and oil after her. Bubbles and steam erupted from the spot where she had disappeared. Within seconds, only wreckage and oil remained on the surface. The precise time of Ward's sinking was recorded as 13:05 on December 7, 1944. She came to rest in approximately 200 feet of water, roughly 4 miles northwest of Ponson Island in Ormoc Bay. Her exact location remained uncertain for decades, as wartime documentation focused on recording casualties and continuing operations rather than precisely marking sunken vessels in contested waters. But her position was approximately charted for future reference should anyone ever seek to find her. Casualty reports indicated minimal loss of life from Ward's crew, a testament to Commander Davis's quick decision to abandon ship and the professionalism of nearby vessels in conducting rescue operations. Most of Ward's complement survived, pulled from the water by destroyers, destroyer escorts, and landing ships. They were transferred to other vessels, reassigned to new ships, and continued serving until war's end. But they never forgot the Ward or the unique distinction of serving aboard the ship that fired first and paid the ultimate price. The war continued for another 9 months after Ward's sinking. American forces liberated the Philippines, invaded Okinawa, and prepared for the assault on Japan's home islands. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the conflict. Before that invasion became necessary, millions of Americans who had served returned home, including most of Ward's survivors. They carried their memories of December 7, 1941, and December 7, 1944, for the rest of their lives. In the immediate post-war period, Ward's story received modest attention. Historical accounts of Pearl Harbor invariably mentioned the destroyer's attack on the Miite submarine, and the coincidence of her sinking exactly 3 years later was noted in various articles and books. But with thousands of ships lost during the war and millions of individual stories competing for recognition, Ward gradually faded from public consciousness. The ship became a footnote, remembered primarily by veterans, naval historians, and the families of men who had served aboard her. The Minnesota connection kept Ward's memory alive in one corner of America. Since most of her crew had come from the St. Paul area, local veterans organizations maintained interest in the ship's history. Reunions were held periodically, attended by dwindling numbers of survivors as the decades passed. High school history classes in Minnesota sometimes featured Ward's story, emphasizing the local connection to a major historical event. But beyond the upper Midwest, few Americans could have identified USS Ward or explained her significance. This began changing in the late 1990s when advances in underwater search technology made it feasible to locate and document World War II wrecks in deep water. The National Park Service, which manages war graves and historic shipwrecks, expressed interest in finding Ward her symbolic importance. Combined with excellent documentation of her approximate sinking location, made her an attractive candidate for a search expedition. In 2000, a team led by underwater archaeologist James Delgado began looking for Ward in Ormoc Bay. The search utilized side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles to survey the suspected area. Philippine waters presented challenges. Visibility was often poor, Currents were strong, and decades of fishing activity had scattered debris across the bottom. But in December 2001, 60 years after the Pearl Harbor attack, the team located a wreck matching Ward's dimensions and configuration in the approximate location indicated by wartime records. Video documentation showed a destroyer-type vessel resting upright on the bottom. Her superstructure collapsed, but her hull largely intact. Positive identification came from specific features visible in the video footage. The ship's configuration matched Ward's post-conversion arrangement as a high-speed transport. The location correlated with documented sinking coordinates. Perhaps most tellingly, shell holes from O'Brien's final bombardment were clearly visible in the hull plating. This was unquestionably USS Ward, the ship that had opened and symbolically closed a chapter in American history, now resting in eternal patrol in Philippine waters. The discovery generated renewed interest in Ward's story. Television documentaries featured the wreck footage. Books examining the first shots at Pearl Harbor devoted chapters to the ship and her crew. The Naval History and Heritage Command updated its records with precise location data. Ward's story reached new audiences who had never heard of the aging destroyer that had been in the right place at the right time on a Sunday morning in 1941. In 2002, the wreck site was designated a war grave, protected under international agreements governing such sites. Salvage and souvenir hunting are prohibited. The Ward lies where she fell, a memorial to her crew and to all those who served in the Pacific War. Occasionally, research vessels visit the site to document changes in the wreck's condition or to conduct archaeological studies. But mostly she rests undisturbed, gradually succumbing to corrosion and marine growth. For the surviving crew members, the wreck's discovery provided closure. Several veterans traveled to the Philippines to participate in memorial ceremonies above the wreck site. They placed wreaths on the water and saluted as taps played across the bay. These were elderly men now, some in their 80s and 90s, but they stood straight and honored their ship with the dignity she deserved. One by one, the survivors passed away, taking their first-hand memories with them. The last known survivor of Ward's Pearl Harbor action died in 2015. With his passing, the living connection to that historic morning was severed. But the story endures, preserved in naval records, historical accounts, and the physical evidence resting on Ormoc Bay's floor. USS Ward remains what she was from the beginning, a symbol of vigilance, sacrifice, and the unpredictable nature of war. Her legacy extends beyond simple historical footnote status. Ward's story reminds us that great events often hinge on the actions of ordinary people doing their duty. The reservists from Minnesota who crewed her were not elite warriors or specially selected heroes. They were average Americans who answered their country's call, learned their jobs, and performed with courage and competence when the moment demanded it. That their ship happened to be in position to fire the first shots was partly luck, but their decisive response was entirely professional. The symmetry of Ward's service, bracketed by 2 December 7ths, resonates across the decades. She began America's war with Japan and ended her service on the anniversary of that beginning, destroyed by the same enemy in the same conflict. This perfect historical arc gives Ward's story a narrative completeness that few other warships can claim. She witnessed both the opening and the symbolic closing of a great struggle, serving faithfully throughout and paying the ultimate price. Today, Ward's bell, salvaged before her sinking, resides at the Minnesota State Capitol, a tangible connection to the ship and her crew. The bell that sounded general quarters on December 7, 1941, now serves as a memorial, reminding visitors of Minnesota's connection to a pivotal moment in American history. Veterans, historians, and curious citizens pause before it, reading the plaques that tell Ward's story and honoring the men who sailed with her. The story of USS Ward confirms what naval officers have known for centuries. Ships are more than steel and machinery. They become living entities, imbued with the spirit of their crews and the weight of their histories. Ward earned her place in American memory through circumstance and courage, through being present when history demanded action and responding without hesitation. Her story deserves remembrance not because she was the most powerful warship or won the most battles, but because she embodied the qualities that define naval service: vigilance, readiness, and sacrifice. In the quiet waters of Ormuk Bay, USS Ward keeps her eternal watch, a steel monument to valor and the costs of war.